Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are going deep on something that's probably been hitting everyone's wallets lately, inflation. And we've got this academic paper here that really gets into like the nitty-gritty of it all, especially how it impacts entrepreneurs and small businesses. Now, I know inflation can sound a little bit dry, but I promise this deep dive is going to be anything but.
It really is some fascinating stuff. We always hear how inflation is bad, but sometimes it can actually create opportunities for entrepreneurs, if the circumstances are right, of course.
Hold on. Beneficial. That's a new one. I always thought it just meant like everything gets more expensive.
Well, yeah, prices do go up,
Yeah.
but there's a lot more to it than that. Essentially, inflation is about the decreasing purchasing power of money over time. To put it simply, a dollar today buys you less than it did a few years ago.
Okay, yeah, now that you mention it, I do remember when a dollar could get you a candy bar.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand inflation. Our source defines it as the long-term increase in prices of services and goods due to the devaluation of currency.
So it's not just that like prices are going up, it's that our money is literally becoming less valuable.
Right. And that's why inflation is usually expressed as a percentage. When you hear about a 2% inflation rate, it means the overall price level has increased by 2% compared to like the previous period. It's like a slow erosion of your money's buying power.
That makes sense. But how do they actually measure that inflation percentage?
Well, one way is through the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. It tracks the average change in
Right.
prices that urban consumers pay for a basket of goods and services. So we're talking groceries, gas, housing, healthcare, all that.
So like they're keeping tabs on this hypothetical shopping cart to see how much more expensive it gets. That's actually a pretty clever way to visualize it.
It is. But it's important to note that the CPI has its limitations. It doesn't reflect everyone's spending habits perfectly, especially since it focuses mainly on urban consumers. Someone living in a rural area might have a very different experience with inflation.
Good point. It's like an average. So it won't perfectly reflect everyone's situation. But it gives us a useful benchmark to understand the bigger picture at least.
Absolutely. Now let's get into what causes this whole inflationary roller coaster. It's a complicated interplay of different factors, but one of the key ingredients is the balance between supply and demand.
Oh yeah, I remember learning about supply and demand back in school, like a fundamental economic dance-off.
That's a great analogy. Our source uses a seesaw to explain it. When demand for goods and services goes up faster than supply, it's like one side of the seesaw shooting up. Prices rise, and we get inflation.
So if everyone suddenly wants the newest gadget, but there aren't enough to go around, the price skyrockets. We've seen that happen with like new game consoles and even things like graphics cards.
Exactly. Economists call that demand pull inflation. But what about situations where the costs of production are increasing? A prime example is the oil market. If there's a sudden shortage of oil, maybe because of geopolitical tensions or natural disasters, the cost of producing gasoline and other petroleum-based products increases. That's cost push inflation, and we all feel it at the pump.
Ugh, tell me about it. Filling up my car lately has been painful. So we've got demand driving up prices,
Yeah.
and we've got rising production costs pushing them up even further. What other things contribute to this whole inflationary mix?
Well, national debt can play a big role. When a country's debt increases, the government might print more money to pay it off. This might seem like an easy solution, but it can actually make inflation worse.
I can see how that would happen, more money circulating. But the same amount of goods and services?
Exactly. It's like everyone suddenly wins the lottery and they all try to buy the same limited edition sports car. The price would go through the roof. And that brings us to another key factor: exchange rates. When a country increases its exposure to foreign marketplaces, meaning it imports more goods and services from other countries, its inflation can be affected by changes in exchange rates. For example, if the dollar weakens against other currencies, the cost of imported goods goes up, which can push up overall prices.
Wow, that's fascinating. It really makes you think about how interconnected everything is in the economy. So we've got this complex web of factors all influencing inflation. And it's not just one size fits all, right?
You got it. Inflation comes in different flavors. And we're going to break down the main types after a quick break. Stay with us.
All right, we'll be right back. Okay, so we're back and ready to like unpack these different types of inflation. It's not just one size fits all, is it?
Nope, not at all. We already kind of touched on demand pull and cost push inflation earlier, so let's dive a little deeper into those two, and then we can explore another interesting type: anticipated inflation.
Perfect. I'm all about those real world examples. They really help me wrap my head around these concepts.
All right, well, let's say you're looking to buy a house. And you notice that prices are just going up and up. That's often a sign of demand pull inflation in action, when demand for houses is really high. And there are way more buyers than sellers. Prices naturally rise.
So basically like a bidding war for your dream home can actually contribute to inflation. Makes sense, but I never really thought about it that way.
It's all about those market forces at play. Now let's think about cost push inflation. We can stick with another real-world example. Imagine there's like a global shortage of lithium, a key ingredient in those electric car batteries. This shortage drives up the cost of producing the batteries. And guess what? Those increased costs get passed on to us, the consumer.
Oh man, this is making me rethink how I view my own spending. It's easy to think companies are just being greedy, but sometimes it really is these like external factors that are pushing prices up.
That's a great point. It's easy to get caught up in the blame game, but understanding these bigger economic forces can give us some perspective. Now let's talk about anticipated inflation, which is a little more psychological. If people expect prices to rise in the future, they might start spending more now, before things get even more expensive. This increase in demand can actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy, leading to actual inflation.
So if everyone thinks prices are going up, their actions could actually make it happen. That's kind of wild.
It really is. It's this fascinating feedback loop, where expectations influence behavior, which then impacts the economy. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about how all of this actually affects you, the listener.
Yeah, let's get down to like the brass tacks. Is inflation always a bad thing?
Well, that's where things get interesting. It's not a simple black and white issue. The research shows that different groups are affected by inflation differently, and sometimes it can even have some positive impacts.
Okay, I'm really curious now. Tell me more about these upsides.
Well, let's consider someone who's looking for a job. During a time of mild inflation, businesses often do really well, which can lead to more hiring. So if you're on the job hunt, a little inflation might actually be a good thing.
Wow, that's not what I expected at all. I always thought inflation was just straight up bad news. But I guess if companies are doing well and expanding, they need more workers.
Exactly. And a healthy amount of inflation can actually stimulate economic growth because it encourages people to spend and invest their money, rather than just hoarding cash that's losing value over time. This boost in economic activity can create more jobs, lead to higher wages, and just generally bring more prosperity.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot, that Goldilocks level of inflation where things are just right.
You got it. Not too hot, not too cold. And borrowers can also sometimes benefit from mild inflation. Let's say you borrowed like $10,000 5 years ago because of inflation. That 10 grand you're paying back today is actually worth less in today's money.
So it's like inflation is slowly eating away at the value of that debt, making it a bit easier to pay back.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. Of course, this only really works if your income has kept pace with inflation. If not, you're definitely still going to feel the squeeze. And speaking of feeling the squeeze, let's talk about how inflation affects people who are on fixed incomes.
Yeah, that was a big focus in the research. It seems like inflation can really make economic inequality worse.
Absolutely. Think about retirees living on a fixed pension, or people who rely on Social Security benefits. If their income isn't increasing along with inflation, their purchasing power is constantly decreasing. The source gives a pretty stark example. A $25,000 annual income loses a lot of value with even just a 2% inflation rate. It's essentially like getting a pay cut every single year.
Man, that's tough. It's like they're working harder and harder just to stay in the same place.
And unfortunately, that is the reality for a lot of people, especially for folks on the lower end of the income spectrum. They're the ones who get hit the hardest by those rising prices, especially for essential things like food and housing and healthcare.
It really sounds like inflation can make the gap between the haves and have-nots even bigger.
That's definitely a key takeaway here. And then, of course, there's that extreme scenario, hyperinflation. Our source described it as like rapid and often uncontrollable currency devaluation.
Yeah, the example they gave about Venezuela was really eye-opening. It's hard to imagine your life savings suddenly becoming worthless.
Hyperinflation is a terrifying thought. That's when inflation spirals completely out of control, and prices just skyrocket incredibly fast. People lose faith in the currency, businesses can't operate normally, and even basic necessities become unaffordable.
It's like a worst-case economic scenario.
It really is.
So we've seen how inflation can be both good and bad.
Right. It all depends on the specific circumstances.
It's definitely not a simple issue. And it's important to understand all the little details. But let's bring it back to entrepreneurship now. The research really dug into that connection between inflation and starting a business.
It's a really interesting dynamic, and I think it's worth exploring further.
Okay, so back to that million-dollar question. Is high inflation good or bad for entrepreneurs?
Yeah, is it good or bad? Well, it's not as simple as you might think. The research we looked at suggests that. Inflation actually kind of creates this dynamic landscape for entrepreneurs. It presents both challenges and opportunities. It's all about navigating those choppy waters strategically.
So it's not just a simple, like, thumbs up or thumbs down.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Tell me more about this entrepreneurial balancing act.
Sure. So let's start with the challenges. As we talked about earlier, rising inflation usually leads to higher production costs. Think about all the costs involved: raw materials, energy, even wages. All of those expenses can go up. And that makes it more expensive for entrepreneurs to actually create and sell their products or services.
Yeah, that makes total sense. If all the ingredients for your pizza dough are more expensive, you're going to have to raise the price of that pizza to make up for it.
Exactly. And then you got to think about it from the consumer side, too. When people are feeling the effects of inflation, they might start cutting back on things they don't absolutely need. And that, of course, hurts small businesses and entrepreneurs, especially the ones who rely on people having extra money to spend.
So there's definitely some downsides. But the research also mentions some potential upsides for entrepreneurs, right? What are some of those?
Yeah, so one interesting point is that rising interest rates, which often go hand in hand with inflation, can sometimes lead to more funding options for entrepreneurs.
Wait, really? I thought higher interest rates made it, like, harder and more expensive to borrow money.
Well, you're right that loans do become more expensive. But higher interest rates also mean lenders can make a better return on their investments. So it kind of incentivizes them to lend more, even to smaller businesses that might be a little riskier. Businesses that might have had a harder time getting funding when interest rates were lower.
So it's like a double-edged sword. More access to cash, but at a higher cost. Entrepreneurs would really have to weigh their options carefully.
For sure, it's a strategic decision. And here's another potential upside. Inflation can create opportunities for entrepreneurs to raise their prices.
That seems risky, though. Won't customers just go somewhere else if prices get too high? I know I'm definitely more careful about what I'm spending when I feel like inflation is hitting my wallet.
It's all about finding the sweet spot. But here's the thing. If everyone's costs are going up because of inflation, consumers might be more understanding of price increases, especially if those increases are reasonable and reflect the real value of the product or service.
So it's not just about, like, jacking up prices for no reason. It's about being upfront with your customers and showing them that what you're offering is worth that extra money.
Exactly. It's all about building trust and having good relationships with your customers. Now, the research really focused on this idea of like beating inflation. I think it's a really important concept for entrepreneurs to embrace.
Yeah, I'm all ears. How can entrepreneurs not just survive inflation, but actually thrive in this kind of environment? What are the secrets?
Well, one big strategy is to explore different pricing models. Instead of just raising prices across the board, you can experiment with things like subscription models or tiered pricing or even bundling products and services together. These approaches can help capture more value and offset those rising costs.
That's a great point. It's about thinking outside the box.
Right. Another important strategy is to try to hedge against those rising costs. So let's say an entrepreneur knows that the price of a certain material they need is probably going to increase. They might try to lock in a good price now, maybe through a futures contract, or by stocking up on inventory.
So it's all about being proactive.
Yeah.
Anticipate those price changes. Don't just wait for the wave to hit you. Get ahead of it.
Exactly. And finally, I think it's super important for entrepreneurs to remember that inflation can actually create brand new opportunities. When prices are going up, people are always looking for ways to save money or to find more value for their dollar. This can open doors for businesses that come up with innovative solutions that are cost-effective, or that address new consumer needs that are popping up.
Wow, I love that way of looking at it. Inflation isn't just this big, scary threat. It's a chance to get creative, adapt and find new ways to serve your customers.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The key takeaway here is that entrepreneurs who can be flexible and innovative and customer-focused, those are the ones who are going to not just survive, but thrive during times of high inflation. It's about looking at the challenge and turning it into an opportunity.
I love that perspective. It's not about being scared of inflation. It's about understanding it and using it to your advantage.
Exactly. Knowledge is power. The more we know about inflation, the better we can make smart decisions, both in our businesses and in our personal lives.
Well, I think we've covered a ton of ground today, from like Inflation 101 to how it affects entrepreneurs and the whole economy.
It's been a really interesting conversation. I hope our listeners found it helpful.
I know I have. Any final thoughts?
Just a reminder that inflation is complicated. It has pluses and minuses. High inflation can be really bad, of course, but a little bit of inflation can actually be a good thing for the economy. The key is to stay informed and make good decisions based on your own personal situation.
That's great advice. And after everything we've talked about today, I hope everyone listening will really think about how inflation is impacting their own finances. Are you making the most of the opportunities? Are you managing the risks? It's definitely a conversation worth having. With yourself or with a financial advisor?
Absolutely. The better we understand the forces that are shaping the economy, the better we can navigate them.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been a really eye-opening discussion.
My pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into inflation. I hope you found it informative, and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep learning and keep those wallets happy.